Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next lecture in our series of lectures on various lenses of literary criticism. In last week's lecture, I introduced the idea of literary theory, which forms the basis of performing literary criticism, which is going to be a large portion of what we're doing in this class. And we discussed the lenses of literary criticism that we put on. Remember the metaphor of the glasses that we put on that change the way that we look at a text. And this week we're going to be discussing our first lens of literary criticism, and that is formalism. I included a brief introduction to formalism in last week's lecture, and last week's discussion board asked you all to take a look at two short stories and analyze one element of formalism from either of those texts. So if you still feel like you need a little bit of a refresher, my recommendation is going to be to go back and look at the Using Formalism handout, which provides a great background, as well as the list of formalist elements, some of which I will cover in today's lecture. So to begin, we need to go back to the basics of asking ourselves, what is formalism? What does it mean to perform a formalist literary criticism? Formalism is a lens of literary criticism that focuses on the form of the work. So focusing on the text as itself, the text just in the world of the text without considering outside factors. Taking a look and doing what I often like to refer to as a close reading of the text. So this is where those skills that you are developing from our first lecture on entering the conversation and metacognitive reading, those skills of reading and annotating a text closely, looking at the individual choices of the author, formalism is where that's going to really start to come into play. The form that we're looking at, the form or the shape, is sometimes another way referred to, the form consists of the various literary elements that contribute to the strength and the development of the work. Many people often think that writers sit down and their stories and novels and poems just flow directly out of them without any thought to structure, organization, word choice, or stylistic choice. And this is kind of a naive perspective. What you will learn in both studying literature and in studying the techniques of writing is that there are many choices inherent in the process of writing. And writers choose various literary elements to contribute to the power of their work or the development of their ideas. So formalism is kind of an example of taking a piece of text and putting it under the microscope to look at how that author made specific choices that contribute to how their story developed. Why do we begin with formalism? Why is that the first lens of literary theory that we focus on? Mostly because formalism is often something familiar to students, and formalism focuses only on the features of the text, without regard to the historical, cultural, and political context of the text. So formalism is a little bit easier because we can narrow our vision to focus only on the individual features of the text and the individual formalist elements that are being used in the text. So if you haven't done so already, I want to suggest, recommend that you print out that Using Formalism handout, because all of those elements are really useful to become familiar with. As you're reading the short stories in the first section of this course, in our first unit on formalist literary theory, it's much easier to begin to recognize the individual elements that the authors employ if you have that list nearby and you're familiar with these terms. So think of these as the sort of context-specific vocabulary, and it's good to have that handy. The focus in formalism is on the pieces of the puzzle, or also known as the literary devices that shape the work in subtle but identifiable ways. And we've already started this work in our first discussion boards. We looked at the individual pieces of the puzzle in Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, and looked at the use of symbolism, looked at the use of tone, looked at the use of character development, and what is known as Hemingway's classic restraint while writing. How do those choices by Hemingway shape the work? And as readers, how does it shape our understanding that Hemingway specifically chose to leave out certain pieces of information or take into consideration various elements such as the setting of the work? We continued this work last week with Desiree's Baby and The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, wonderful examples of short stories that pack a great punch. They have quite a bit of identifiable ways that the authors have chosen to employ some of those literary devices. So formalism is often what I like to start with because many students have been introduced to formalism in previous classes where they looked at things like the use of metaphor, simile, personification. Perhaps they've looked at character development, plot, foreshadowing, and some of these other terms. However, if you are not familiar with those terms, that's okay. We're going to cover them in this lecture, and we're going to get lots of practice in the next few weeks in the discussion boards before you write your first paper, which is going to employ the formalist lens of literary theory. So in order to understand formalism, we have to start with understanding literary devices. Literary devices are the tools of individual writers, the tools that they employ to convey their message or develop their story, or even shock the reader with a surprising twist or turn of events that they have laid subtle clues for, such as the twist ending of The Lottery or Desiree's Baby. So what are some of these literary devices? I'm not going to cover all of them in today's lecture because there are hundreds of literary devices. However, there's more information in the handout, as I mentioned, and you can always continue your studies on your own. So these are those pieces of the puzzle. You can think of them as the individual Legos that writers use to build their master works. So to begin with, we start with character. Who are the people in these short stories? Character development is a large part of formalist theory and formalist criticism because it's often easy to identify various literary devices of characters. You'll be familiar with some of these. Hopefully you've heard the term protagonist. This is another term for the main character, and often the main character is one with whom the audience is expected to sympathize. So when we read, the author often chooses a main character that the audience or the readers can identify with, or at least sympathize with their needs, their wants, their desires. So in an adventure tale, the protagonist is the hero. In a coming-of-age novel, the protagonist would be the young man or woman whose story is being told. You can think of Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye as the quintessential protagonist, main character, and the audience is intended to both understand that character and to know more about that character than they know about themselves. A quick note for you all to recognize, and this comes up every semester, it's important to understand that the protagonist or the main character is not the same as the author when we are reading fiction. I stress this because sometimes many people believe that if an author wrote something, then it must be based on their own lives or their own stories. And fiction writers often draw upon their own experiences, but the author and the protagonist, in the case of fiction, are different people. And that's an important distinction to make. On the other hand, we have the antagonist, the main villain, usually in opposition to the protagonist, and not to be confused with an anti-hero, such as Walter White in Breaking Bad. TV shows often have anti-heroes lately. I feel that there's a common trend for us not necessarily to root for the protagonist, but instead to see their faults. That is not the same thing as the antagonist. The antagonist is often the person who causes some sort of either challenge, some sort of obstacle, some sort of difficulty, or sometimes some sort of emotional change in the main character. There's not always a clear antagonist. It's not always the case that there will be a Darth Vader character in every short story, but this is one of those literary devices that you can look out for as you are reading. As you're reading your short stories, recognize, whom do I think is the protagonist of the story? Whom do I feel represents the antagonist or the agent of challenge or change? Many students are introduced to literary formalism through figures of speech. They might not have referred to it as formalist theory, but they're familiar with some common figures of speech that are part of narrative storytelling. That includes allegory. An allegory is a parallel story with an underlying moral or message. So the most common ones are allegories of ancient tales, including stories from the Bible. So, for example, if you had to read East of Eden by John Steinbeck, you may have learned that that is an allegory for the tale of Adam and Eve and later Cain and Abel from the Bible. In addition, allegories are really common in popular culture. Think of the lion, Aslan, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who represents a Jesus-like figure who sacrifices himself for the good of mankind and then, spoiler alert, is resurrected just as Jesus was in the Bible. So an allegory is a parallel story, often related to a story from history, such as ancient Greek myths or stories from the Bible. Allegories also come from other cultures, Asian cultures, Eastern cultures, and other religions. Allegory is very commonly noticed when there are characters who have specific concrete moral traits or specific characteristics that recall characters from ancient tales. Metaphor is an extremely common figure of speech because it covers several smaller literary devices. So a metaphor is sometimes brief and sometimes an extended comparison of something with something else. So metaphor is a larger category that includes examples such as similes, such as personification. These examples come up often in creative writing because metaphor is how certain ideas and images are conveyed without having to spell it out explicitly for the reader, which would not be a particularly interesting way to tell a story. So think of an expression like love is a battlefield. Now, of course, this is being used figuratively. We don't put on a suit of armor and head out into the fields to fight for the death when it comes to love, but in some cases, love can feel like a constant battle of the wills where one side is attempting to triumph over another. If you're looking for examples of metaphor, Love and other emotion-based words are often really common places where metaphors, similes, and personification are employed. Personification, that's a term you've heard me use before, is when inanimate things are compared to people, or more specifically, when inanimate objects are given human-like qualities. Okay? It's important to distinguish personification. That's when something that is not a human, something that is not a person or a human being, is given qualities of a human being. So when someone says something like, fate is a cruel mistress, obviously fate is not an actual human being mistress. It's an example of personification. The opposite can sometimes happen where people are given qualities that should only belong to inanimate objects. That is not personification. So if you're looking for examples of personification, look for examples of inanimate objects being compared to human-like qualities, like the ocean breathed a sigh of relief on that cool, crisp morning. Oceans don't breathe. People breathe. Human beings breathe. So look for those examples of inanimate objects given those human-like qualities. Personification is often used to set a mood or set a tone or reveal something about the dynamic or the setting of the story and where the story takes place. So personification is often used to kind of give a sense of what we can expect. It's often employed when it comes to setting the tone and even sometimes foreshadowing, which is another common figure of speech, another common literary element that I will discuss. Here we have a quote from writer Aldous Huxley. The essay is a literary device for saying almost everything about almost anything. I particularly like this quote because it really shows you the power of the essay, the power of writing, is that almost anything can be said about almost everything. And we certainly have tried. As human beings, as a society, we have tried to write about every subject under the sun, and in particular, an essay is a way to convey these deep human emotions and feelings, connections, ideas, and concepts. If you've ever read something and thought to yourself, I never thought about it that way before, that's an example of the power of the essay for saying almost everything about almost anything. Continuing with our discussion of figures of speech, we have simile. Similes are often easy to spot because we see a few key phrases. A simile is under the category of a metaphor where something or someone is as a or as something else. For example, as American as apple pie. Now, what does that mean? The idea is that our figurative associations with apple pie is that it is a very traditional American dessert. So to say that someone or something is as American as apple pie is using simile to tell the reader a little bit about that person or a little bit about that thing. So what associations do we have between those things? And similes are often used with the word like. Frequently in creative writing, you will see examples of what is known as metonymy, which is using the story of a small localized event to illustrate a larger social concern, or more simply, comparing a part with the whole. When I talk about figures of speech, they often employ this figurative language, so not literal. When we refer to a group of people as the suits, figuratively speaking, this is referring to them as being lawyers. For example, when it comes to the army, you might say something like, there were 20,000 boots on the ground. Now, there may be a literal 20,000 boots on the ground, but in this case, it's used figuratively to refer to the soldiers on the ground. This is an example of metonymy. So a small part of something represents the whole, or a small example of something illustrates a larger social concern or a larger social phenomenon. And last but not least, we have symbolism. Symbolism is wonderful. Symbolism uses inanimate or imagined things to stand in for real situations. When we're reading, symbolism is what draws that rich, deeper meaning in the text. Many of you, when you read Hills Like White Elephants, were able to identify some of Hemingway's wonderful examples of symbolism, specifically the hills seeming similar to the rolling shape of a pregnant woman's stomach, representing this imagined scenario of pregnancy being represented through the setting. Another example is the symbolism of them discussing white elephants. A few of you pointed out that the term white elephant often refers to something, usually a gift that is not wanted. What in this story is sometimes a gift and sometimes not wanted? An unwanted pregnancy. Symbolism is very common, and it's often an easy way for students to access what I mean by formalist theory. When they're reading something, they recognize that there's a deeper meaning behind the text. Maybe if you find yourself asking questions about what's this all about, or what does this mean, you might recognize that it could potentially be an example of symbolism. As you gear up this week to read this week's short stories, keep in mind that these stories are incredibly rich with symbolism. The story The Open Boat by Stephen Crane and A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel Garcia Marquez are richly drawn stories of deep symbolism, and that's why I've paired them together. They might seem like quite different writers and quite different stories, but the focus this week is on how does symbolism play into the other literary devices? How do these writers employ various elements of formalist theory to further the structure and organization of their text? Another category of literary elements are imagery elements, or the specific details used to describe characters, situations, things, or ideas. So think of imagery as covering all of the 5 senses: hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, and then also extrasensory images that take you to an imaginary world of sensation. So think of that as your sort of 6th sense, as it were, when it comes to literary devices. So when you are reading a story and the specific word choice helps you to imagine sounds that you can hear in your mind, or have a mental image, a mental picture that your mind draws through reading the text, even images of smelling that bring to mind the memories of odors and aromas, sometimes good, sometimes bad. They say that smell is the strongest sense tied to memory. And so I don't know what the connection would be about reading about smelling something, but oftentimes characters will have a moment of smelling or even tasting something that draws them back into their memory, and it might help the reader to engage with the text and to understand a bit about what the author is trying to convey in that nostalgic recollection. You can think of the famous example of Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, where the beginning stage of the novel, Proust bites into a Madeleine cookie and it reverts him back in his memory to his childhood and sets off the beginning of that novel. Of course, we have to include touch, where characters can describe the sensations of touching something in such a way that the reader is able to imagine the experience. And then, of course, those extra sensory senses that help readers imagine this world of sensation. This is what happens when you read something that you haven't personally experienced before, but you can live vicariously through the characters and imagine that world of sensation. Many of my students can connect to this idea when they read science fiction or fantasy novels, or at the very least they've read maybe a Harry Potter book, and there are elements of magical creatures and experiences and even foods that don't exist, that readers are able to imagine that sensation through the rich imagery in the text. Up next, we have plot. Plot is somewhat of the forgotten or not paid attention to literary device that often has quite an effect. We begin with the inciting incident. Most stories often have an event that marks the beginning of a course of action. This is part of how writers draw their readers in and keep their entertainment, keep their attention kind of engaged with the material, because there's one event and that sets off the beginning of the story. It's also known as the inciting inciting incident. So look at these literary devices and see, can you recognize them in some of the stories that we've read so far? What was the inciting incident in the last few stories that we've read? Perhaps you can think of the lottery, and the day of the lottery arrives, and therefore the inciting event is that that fateful day has arrived in this town. Once again, you may be familiar with the term climax, or the point of the highest dramatic tension in a text. Usually we can recognize this frequently in movies. There is one scene or a point of dramatic tension where all of the different storylines come together, or all of the different factors come together in this point of high dramatic tension that must be resolved. So in the case of action movies, this is often one sort of final showdown. In the case of many stories, it's where different threads and different ideas come together, and some great obstacle or challenge or emotional moment has come to pass, and that is what's known as the climax of the story. And after that, we have what's known as the denouement, or the final part of any type of storytelling, whether it's a play, movie, or any type of narrative, in which the strands of the plot are drawn together and matters are explained or resolved. And so we often reach this critical mass point with the climax where the tension must be resolved, and there may be a fight scene, or there may be some critical event that occurs, and what happens afterwards, the sort of resolution of the story, is that denouement. And it often, in fairy tales, is where we get what's known as the sort of happy ending. Although I will say that very few of the stories we read in this class have what's known as a happy ending. Short stories are often more powerful because of the range of emotions that they explore, and they don't tend to tie themselves up neatly with a bow. And that leads us directly to our next discussion of conflict. Now, you might be familiar with that term, conflict, but we're talking about a different type of conflict when it comes to narratives, when it comes to short stories and fiction writing. And these are the plot features that demonstrate human rivalries or difficulties, whether internal or external. So we're often familiar with conflict that is external, perhaps in our own lives, conflict that you might have with others, but frequently in the case of fiction, because we can sort of look inside the minds of our characters, we have to consider how conflict is occasionally only internal. Internal conflict related to emotional exchanges, relationship dynamics, or personal development. So those external conflicts, they're similar to external conflicts we have in real life, active, even physical or overtly expressed. Two characters who are at odds with one another, or a group of characters who are at odds with one another. These are, generally speaking, easier to recognize. And then we have internal conflicts, conflicts that are passive, perhaps mental or covertly expressed. So as you are reading stories, ask yourself, what external conflicts can I recognize, and what internal conflicts may be harder to read? And this is challenging because it requires us to put ourselves in the minds of the characters. And this is one of the unique capabilities of being a human being, is we have the ability to imagine someone else's mind. If you've ever taken psychology, or even in a human biology class, you might learn of what's known as the theory of mind, and it's what separates us from other creatures on Earth. What separates human beings from other animals is our ability to imagine the mind of another, imagine those internal conflicts. Foreshadowing. Now we come to one of my favorite literary devices, foreshadowing. I think foreshadowing is the sort of secret pet of all English professors. We love foreshadowing because it often is so recognizable once you've learned how to recognize it. So what is foreshadowing? These are plot features or plot elements that predict other events, such as the climax or the denouement, as I mentioned before, that predict that final conflict, usually an external conflict that the tension has built up, or predicts the ending of the story, how the resolution occurs, that denouement that I just described. And so foreshadowing, from my perspective, is a little bit like the breadcrumbs that are left along the way, the trail markers of where the author is headed with their story. And this is one of the reasons I often encourage my students to read the stories several times. The first time you read a short story, you'll get a sense of the plot, you'll get familiar with the characters, perhaps recognize a few examples of metaphor, simile, personification, and other figurative elements. And then, once you have read all the way through and are familiar with the climax or denouement, on the second reading, you're much more capable of recognizing the elements of foreshadowing in the text. A perfect example, which I posted a really wonderful discussion board example of when we were reading Desiree's Baby by Kate Chopin, is how wonderfully she employs foreshadowing to predict the twist ending of what occurs in that extremely short story. And that's one of the reasons why I love that story so much, is it really shows readers that a story doesn't need to be long, overly complicated with protagonists and antagonists, and it can still have rich symbolism and tons of foreshadowing. So take a look at that post, the sample discussion board post. That's a post from a former student of mine who was in this class. So it's the same exact kind of work that I'm expecting from all of you. She wrote a wonderful post where she identified various features of the text that foreshadowed the reveal about the letter of Armand's genetic background. So that wonderful twist that puts chills down my spine each time I read that Chopin story. So foreshadowing is a really wonderful literary device that you can start to recognize and grow in your ability to recognize as a reader. But it does require to read closely and to do that metacognitive monitoring that I discussed in my first lecture on annotation. Read slowly and absorb the information. Look at between the lines. What is the author implying with their choices? That's the secret to success when it comes to formalist theory. So what can you find in Desiree's Baby that could be analyzed as foreshadowing? As a test, go back and take a look at that text. It's a short, very short story. And you can perhaps test out your skills of formalist analysis before you begin the more challenging work of this week's formalist practice in our discussion board. Here we have another one of my favorite literary devices, and this is the device of the omniscient narrator. The omniscient narrator who presumes to know the ultimate truth of the story. Short stories, novels, other works of fiction can take place from various perspectives. Sometimes the protagonist is the one telling the story from a first-person perspective, and on occasion, the person telling the story is not one of the characters, but they're a narrator who is looking at the story, looking at the events from an outside perspective. And writers often employ what's known as an omniscient narrator who is aware of all of the various characters' wants, needs, internal emotions, and internal experiences. So the omniscient narrator is a powerful tool of fiction writers who can jump inside the minds of various characters so that more can be expressed. And it allows us as the readers to peek inside their brains. It's one of the true powers of fiction, is to experience the life of another person, which is something we're not really able to do outside of that experience. And last but not least, we come to what is often overlooked but also important literary device employed by writers to convey certain messages. And it's worth remembering that when it comes to formalism, this is another wonderful place to start. So we're talking about setting. Setting can also refer to the atmosphere, the historical period, the physical setting or geographical setting of a text, and sometimes what's often overlooked is the mood of the text and how does the setting contribute to that mood. So keep that in mind as you're reading your stories this week, particularly Stephen Crane's The Open Boat. How does the setting, the physical, geographical setting contribute to our understanding of the text and contribute to the atmosphere? How does Crane's choices of setting this story on the open sea contribute to the messages he's trying to convey beneath the text? So setting might refer to the actual place, the physical or even psychical locations of events, things, characters, and historical time. So psychical meaning referring to the internal landscape of the characters. I tend to gravitate towards stories that take place inside the minds of characters. I like that psychological exploration. So keep in mind that sometimes the setting is not so much about the physical location that the character is in, but their internal emotional landscape. Occasionally, writers will employ flashbacks. These are used to look back into time to understand sort of a how we got to now point when it comes to the text, to understand more of the motivations of the characters, to understand how various points of conflict have developed, and to understand various elements that perhaps will come into play during the climax or denouement of the story. We also have jumping around in time. Another example would be when a story is in media res, or the beginning is more or less in the middle of events. You jump directly into the story without any sort of leading up to or preamble, and perhaps events have even taken place before the story began that are only hinted at or referred to. A great example, again, is Stephen Crane's The Open Boat. In the beginning of the story, the ship has already wrecked. The sailors are attempting to survive in this small rowboat that they are out at sea. So the story begins in media res. The main events or kind of inciting incident has already occurred, and we join the characters where they are in the middle of that story as they figure out how they can survive. And occasionally, setting can refer to the physical or psychical progression of events. And so it's important to keep in mind, ask yourself, how long of a period does this story take place? How does that contribute to the author's perspective? How does that contribute to the hidden messages beneath the text? So keep setting in mind. Setting is often overlooked, or setting is something that we sometimes take for granted as being necessary to the story that the author wanted to tell, but that's not always the case. And in formalism, we look at the setting and identify, why was the author deciding to set the story in this place? Another great example of this would be looking back at our first story, Hills Like White Elephants. Ask yourself, why do you think Hemingway set that story at a train station? What is symbolic about the meeting of the train tracks heading off in different directions? Why is the setting so hot and dry and not conducive to conversation and relaxation? How does it reflect the tension amongst the characters? And what this is going to help us identify is how these literary devices are related to one another. So think of the setting as sort of the author's initial choice that lays the foundation of the story, and they often use that setting to build upon. So they're using those literary elements such as simile, metaphor, personification, imagery, character choice, plot, climax, and they're built upon the foundation of where these stories are set. So that is it for this week's lecture on formalist elements. Please keep in mind that this week's discussion board asks you to focus on only one formalist element. And that's because there's usually a lot to uncover. And so go through as you're reading the stories. Again, my recommendation is read the story over once, read it a second time, annotating, looking for these literary elements, and then begin the process of planning out what your response could be, and narrow your focus to only one element of formalism. Select one. You can choose one from this lecture if you'd like to use these notes, these lecture notes, to inform your discussion of our two texts this week. But please recall that your job is to focus on only one. There are hundreds of literary elements, so find one and explore it in the text and in your response to this week's discussion boards. Thanks for listening. We'll see you at the next lecture.